Okay, I want to talk about something you know a lot about, both professionally and personally, which is the Donbass.
Yes.
Because I think maybe I have a maybe you differ with me on this, but I think that well, so Western civilians know very, very little about what's going on because of the media here and the way they portray everything in Russia and the Ukraine. Um, and I think the ignorance about Donbass, the history of Donbass over the last 8 years, I think that is what's most missing.
Yeah.
I think that if people in the West, ordinary people in the West, knew about what has happened in the Donbass over the last 8 years, they might have a different opinion about the war. And I think this is why they might understand why you have that Z on your lapel. Can you talk about that history just in basic terms? People, I think, know very, very little about it.
Sure. I mean, Russia occupied the Donbass and they hold the people there with guns to their heads, and they use mercenaries as pro-Russian separatists, and the government, the liberal democratic government in Kiev needs to send neo-Nazis there to liberate them. I mean,
It's
that's what
simple.
it is, right? I mean,
Right.
and oh yeah, there might be a few pro-Russian separatists. No, I mean, uh, all you have to do is take a look at the elections, the politics of Ukraine in the in the 90s and the 2000s up till today to see the political and social divide between West and East Ukraine,
Right.
right? And it's competing national identity conceptions. And you
Right.
have to remember that West Ukraine, what was called Galicia, was not actually a part of Ukraine up until the years immediately preceding World War II, right? And up until the
Mm-hmm.
late 30s. It was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or the Austro-Hungarian Empire and briefly
Mm.
Poland before that. And their national identity conception of what it means to be a Ukrainian evolved through those long centuries. It is the principal component of it is certainly not liberalism. It's anti-Russianism. They hate Russia, right? And it
Mm.
just that to the core. That is
Right.
what it is. They didn't like Poles, during that period as well. They didn't weren't crazy, about Jews at that time. But the principal component is anti-Russians. Of course, that is a problem because Ukraine, within its borders, right, as it was became independent in 92, had a population that was some 25% ethnic Russian.
Right.
And a good portion of the rest of the country, we're talking East Ukraine, often is so intermingled with Russian families on both sides of the borders that it's an exercise in futility in many places to say whether someone is ethnic Russian or ethnic Ukrainian in Eastern Ukraine or Western Russia, right? They as a result of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, they're completely intermingled, and there's a long, very heated, fought over history of Ukraine itself, and I'm not going to go into that, but the people of Donbass they view themselves as either Russian ethnically or as possessing, seeing Russians as a brother people with some weird border that somehow got stuck between us and
Mm-hmm.
and them, right?
Right.
They actually do have some political differences with Russia.
Hmm.
They're very Soviet nostalgic, right?
Oh.
Donbass was a big
Oh.
factory and mining area. They have a very um, workers socialist tinge to their politics and their perspective there.
Oh. Hmm.
Um, so you know, there's often jokes among the shall we say the more pro-Western leaning people in the Kremlin, at least up until recent years, that the people of Donbass were actually, something inconvenient. And that they didn't mesh up with, the capitalist so it's sometimes neoliberal perspective in the finance ministry that they wanted to take the Putin administration. There's disagreement within the Putin administration. There are competing elites with different perspectives. There always has been. It's far from some type of totalitarian government or even party or administration or the like. There's lots of Putin has his best skills are actually managing elites, managing differences and different people and using them towards a common. That's what he actually has excelled in, from a very pragmatic, cynical, bitter, realist perspective of the world. But yeah, the people of Donbass, they first of all, they hate the ideology of Banderism, of Stefan Bandera, of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian insurgent army, right? They fought against them, right? Because West Ukraine welcomed Hitler with open arms.
That's right.
They of course, Stefan Banderas and the others, and they dreamed of their own independent fascist Ukraine, right? And an independent Ukraine, an independent fascist Ukraine, because Stefan Bandera was a ideological fascist. And, that's what the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and its military wing, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, were. And they welcomed, they formed up, as volunteer battalions, SS battalions, Nightingale, similarly in the Baltics. And, they fought against the Soviet Union. And they fought, therefore, against the people of Eastern Ukraine. Right?
Okay, yeah. Wow.
It was a little bit broader then. Just on a personal level, my wife has, I'm not sure whether it's an aunt or a great aunt, to be perfectly honest, a family member who, as a young woman, very young, was taken to Germany as a slave from the then Nazi conquered Crimea to work in the factories. She was literally slave labor. She was not taken by Germans. She was rounded up by Western Ukrainian fascists who were at many times far more brutal in their treatment of people of East Ukraine, even at that time, than the Germans troops in many ways were, right? I mean, this is when the UPA went on their ethnic rampages in Galicia against ethnic Russians, against communists, against Poles, against Jews. The SS was often at times like, whoa, chill there. That's pretty brutal and violent there, right? I mean, they were literally butchering. I mean, the photo evidence, all of this was kind of slid under Nuremberg very quietly, because even then the West knew they wanted to use these people against the Soviet Union. But some of the most brutal atrocities of World War II were committed by the Ukrainian insurgent army there. And yeah, they wanted an independent Ukraine. They wanted an independent fascist Ukraine. And Stepan Bandera, they're often said, oh yeah, he worked with the Nazis originally, but then they put him in a concentration camp. Yeah, they put him in special political conditions because he got a little bit too big for his britches. And he continued to work for them, to encourage the Ukrainian insurgent army to work with them. He met, while in his special concentration camp conditions, at a nearby castle to help facilitate the work between the West Ukrainian ultranationalists and Nazi Germany. And yes, he had brothers that were killed in the concentration camp. They weren't killed by the Germans. They were killed by Poles who were inmates in the concentration camp, who found out that these special people in special conditions were involved in the massacre of Poles in Galicia. That's who they were killed by. So all this rewriting of history that's going on there. And when he was let out of his, special political condition, imprisonment as the Soviet Union began the march forward. He went back to putting on his SS uniform and fighting for Nazi Germany to the end in Berlin.
Right.
So, yes, the guy was a fascist. He was a Nazi collaborator. Yeah, he got a little too big for his britches and dreamed of a independent fascist Ukraine, but that doesn't take away from what he was, what he did to the other people of Ukraine. And the people of Donbass, they hate this ideology. This is not the Ukraine that they want to be a part of. And you can see that reflected in the politics of Ukraine, the split between West and East, with the center, of no clear identity conception either way, and going one side or the other, depending on the prevailing economic winds and so forth. And that brings us right up until, to the Maidan. And the way the people of East Ukraine, not just the Donbass, but particularly the Donbass and Crimea, but also the rest of Eastern Ukraine saw it. The government that they overwhelmingly elected was overthrown, right? And there's a lot, this revolution of dignity. Whose dignity? Which Ukrainian people, right? What percentage of them supported the Maidan? Because actually we know this. They never will talk about this. Polls were taken, at least one of them actually commissioned by the U.S. International Republican Institute, of public opinion in Ukraine during the Maidan, about the Maidan. And these, were, respectable, polling agencies that are still used in Ukraine today. And they were reported on in the then American-owned and run pro-Maidan Kiev Post at the time. And you can find those articles out there today. A majority of Ukrainians oppose Euromaidan, right? It's not. Now, it wasn't a huge majority. It was a bare majority. It was 51, 40, 50, 53, 45, with undecided. And then another one was 48, 45. But there were consecutive polls that show the country was clearly split, and that maybe a bare majority opposed the Maidan, but obviously it wasn't all of Ukraine. The people of East Ukraine, they never supported the Maidan. If you take it the way that they have voted since, they have always voted against Maidan parties, right? They voted for the Party of Regions. And when the Party of Regions was overthrown and lustrated, they voted for the opposition bloc, right? All across East Ukraine, but particularly in the Donbass. And it was an anti-Maidan party. Today, the party, as with 14 other political parties in Ukraine, is banned, right? Because they're traitors, right? Because they don't want to be, why are we enemies with Russia? That foreign policy perspective that is both domestic and foreign policy, it's intrinsically tied with the national identity conception of East Ukrainians. They're not allowed to have that opinion. The geopolitical flipping of Ukraine cannot be revisited, which is why even before the conflict broke out, Zelensky charged and arrested both of the two main opposition political parties in Ukraine with treason. They were traitors. They were charged with treason. That's why he banned all the media of East Ukraine. He silenced them before February, right? This was a year ago that he banned all the media of East Ukraine. All the TV stations were shut down. All the print media closed, right? Because they actually showed a greater popularity. They were rising in the polls up above his own party. The servant of the people that he created with his virtual candidacy, named after his comedy TV show where he played a school teacher that accidentally became the president of Ukraine, right? The ultimate virtual created candidate.
Wow.
So they have voted against this. They voted for Zelensky because he was completely vague. He promised to end the conflict in Donbass and to fight corruption, and he was always vague on how that would be done. And then when he got into office, he went right into bed with the ultranationalists, and he became even more of an ultra nationalist and persecuting the people of East Ukraine than Poroshenko was. I mean, some of Zelensky's own comedy movies are banned in Ukraine as they were filmed because they're in the Russian language and you're not allowed to show the Russian language. I mean, how insane is that? That's, I think he started to internalize. He inherited a regime, right, through these, sham elections that had, these Banderite fascist battalions that were an instrumental part of the military, the security arm of the state, but also intrinsically involved with the politics, interspersed throughout the Maidan political parties. And he found that the regime depended on that it couldn't do without it, that it would collapse without it. And so I believe that, despite his Jewish ancestry, he eventually took it on board. In his comedy skits before he became president, he ridiculed, he made fun of the Banderites, of Right Sector and Azov as goose-stepping Nazis.
Oh.
And then when he became president, he was pinning hero medals on them as heroes of Ukraine. So, right. I mean, obviously, the man has a lot of, internal processes and contradictions, and I believe that he's probably ultimately a creature to be pitied more than anything else. But right. That's the Donbass has been opposed to this ever since, and they saw 2014, the Odessa massacre. What has happened since? They want nothing to do with Ukraine anymore because all of this banderism was wrapped in the colors of the blue and yellow rather than the earlier, more identifiable orange color revolution. Mm-hmm. And so because they so co-opted the symbology of the nation of Ukraine, the idea of Ukraine has since become very toxic to them. They want nothing to do with it anymore. They would prefer to be part of Russia because for safety and, a similar culture and politics as they see it anyway, or at least more similar. But, if not that, then independence, right? They don't want to be part of Ukraine governed by this regime in Kiev as it is today. They don't want to be part of an anti-Russian Ukraine. And, there are Ukrainians on both sides of this conflict. There are tens of thousands of Ukrainians fighting alongside Russian forces, or former Ukrainians, if you want to call them that, against the regime. All the time you are reading in the Western media, very quietly and in improving tone, of hundreds of collaborators that are being arrested in every city in Ukraine, of the regime in Kiev firing its head of the intelligence services, the SBU, a lifelong friend of Zelensky, by the way, and his prosecutor general, because hundreds of collaborators, 600 collaborators, were found within the ranks of the intelligence services and the government bureaucracy, the federal prosecutor's office there. Why? That's a question that's never asked. Why are so many Ukrainians collaborators? Why are so many Ukrainians opponents of this regime? Because it's not a liberal democratic, nothing could be further from the truth, right? There are just competing national identity ideas of what Ukraine is and should be. And at this point, I think it's Humpty Dumpty who fell off the wall. I think the Maidan broke Ukraine. It was possible that it might have been put back together under the Minsk Accords. Obviously, Kiev and the West never intended to fulfill those, and it was impossible. And I don't think it's possible to put Ukraine back together again today. I think it will end with the partition or possibly the Balkanization of the country. It's only a question of on what lines, right? Is the line the Donbass? Is the line the Dnieper? Is the line, all of Ukraine but Galicia? It will never be Galicia. It will never be Lvov and Ternopil, Western Ukraine. That will, just toxic.
Right.
If 50 years, 60 years of the Soviet Union could not debanderize Western Ukraine, then nothing will.
Right. I think that one of the things that Westerners don't know, I mean, they just don't know, is that Ukraine has been at war with the Donetsk and
Its own
Luhansk.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, well, what those two republics in particular, the breakaway
Well, I
republics,
mean,
right?
it's those two republics, but you have to understand that actually, the fighters, the militia, as they have often been called, now
Mm-hmm.
the armed forces, they're people from all over East Ukraine. They're
Oh,
not just from the Donbass. There are people from Kharkov.
oh,
There's even members of the Donbass now from Lvov. Not many, right? A
mm-hmm.
handful, right? But from Western Ukraine. There are people from all over Ukraine who, rose up, didn't want to be part of what happened in Kiev and
Right,
cared enough, to take up arms against it and ended up in the Donbass because that's what they could hold in
right.
2014, 2015.
Now, people in Luhansk and Donetsk, and I don't even think this has ever been challenged, say that, I mean, I think this is just a established fact, that the Ukrainian government military bombed and shelled civilian centers in Donetsk and Luhansk in
For
response
8
to,
long
for a,
years
yes, right, beginning in
in,
2014.
in an attempt to subjugate them to their seizure of power in Kiev. Yes,
Now,
since
Mark,
2014,
the thing is though,
Ukraine has been at civil war.
right, but Mark, you need to know that I was watching BBC and PBS documentaries about this very question about the history of Donbass, and both say that the reports about Ukraine military operations against those republics have been exaggerated. Exaggerated. It's
Yeah.
not. It wasn't as bad as we think or you think. So, how bad was it?
Okay, I have family there, and
Yes, I
I have
know. That's
been
why I'm
there
asking.
since
Right.
2014, right? And they have been, I mean, just propagandistically underplayed, completely downplayed. I
Hmm.
mean, they were brutal. It was
Mhm.
constant shelling because they view these people. This is the way that what. Okay, so when the regime seized power in 2014, the military did not follow them, right? They were sent, go after these people in Donbass, right? They're terrorists. And one military unit responded. One brigade was managed to send troops there. And they were greeted by the people of, you can watch the videos on YouTube, they're still out there. They were met by the people of Donbass, right? The ordinary civilians out there greeting their tanks and APCs, with, their own bodies in front of them saying, what are you doing? Give us your weapons, go home, and they stopped and they were completely, what do we do? And they returned and that unit was then disbanded. And it took the regime in Kiev months just to get started, but really a good year or two completely to purge the ranks of the military of anyone who didn't want a part in the new Ukraine that they were building, that saw the Donbass as something that needed to be beat down and Russia as the enemy. There were tens of thousands of defections from the Ukrainian military, police, and intelligence services to either Donbass or Crimea. Even Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, did a report on the Ukrainian Navy. It's still out there, where they admitted that 75% of the Ukrainian Navy defected to Russia because they didn't want to have anything to do with this new regime. It was not a universal consensus. It was not a, dignity of revolution of dignity for some people, not for others, right? So that's when the battalions were armed and sent in and to begin the bloody work of trying to beat the Donbass down before they got firm control of the military there. And they couldn't, they at that time, they couldn't engage effectively hand to hand, right? So that's when they started with the artillery shelling. And they see the people of Donbass, they call them Sovak, right? East Ukrainians, or Vatniks, right? A derogatory, essentially racist term to refer to the people of the East Ukraine who have Soviet nostalgia, who don't agree with the Maidan. It's a dehumanizing term. Another one that they love to use is Colorados to refer to the people of East Ukraine who wear the orange and black that in the beginning symbolized the anti-Maidan political movement. And that is a dual term because the Colorados are a vermin insect in Ukraine to be exterminated, right? That's the type of terminology they have used. And there have been, the political analysts have been on Hromadske, on Kiev, which is basically Maidan. It was Maidan propaganda at the time. It was and is still funded openly by the U.S. State Department and the Dutch embassy. They were created, set up at the beginning of the Maidan to help launch this, right? This is a U.S. State Department and Dutch funded propaganda network that ran revolution as their 24-hour tagline on the screen, right? And they had on analysts who said that there are it's on YouTube. Watch it yourself. This is, official Kiev TV. Analysts said there are 1.5 million useless excess people in the Donbass, right, that just need to be exterminated. They say it outright, just like that. They need to be done away with, right? And so do these people want to be part of that Ukraine? Of course they don't. Right. I mean, they are the true heirs of the Banderites of the 1940s and 50s, completely. And the people of the Donbass, they've suffered for 8 years. I mean, they view the people of Crimea, the same way. They built a dam to stop the flow of water to Crimea, because stopping the collective punishment of the Crimean people for choosing wrong, that was really going to win back the hearts and minds of the Crimean people, right? No, it wasn't about winning. It was about punishing them because they were traitors to the new regime, to the new Ukraine that was being built. And never mind that cutting off water is a crime against humanity. It's also a war crime, and in the context of war, Western media was like, yeah, they cut off water. It's good. They're pro-Russian separatists. That's the way it was treated.
Right.
Similar to the Israelis cutting off water to Palestinians.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, that was very illuminating. Thank you for that. I want to finish by talking about our mutual friend, Alexander Dugin. Now, I've heard you put forward a theory as to why Daria was assassinated. Because on the one hand, you're saying, and I think you're right, that both Alexander and Daria are marginal figures in Russian politics, or certainly were before she was killed. So then why on earth would the Ukrainians care, or anyone would care? Why would they go out of their way to assassinate her? But I think you have said that this is because of what the Western media has been doing.
And the Kiev regime media as well. Yes. They have inflated them through as part of their propaganda to portray, to present the Russian government in such a way, and they have caricaturized them and turned them into these bogeymen. So it's inflated in the mind, and the meme has become the reality. They present Dugin and his daughter, but to an extent his daughter as well, as the architects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as they depict it. And so striking a symbolic blow against him would be, symbolically. Never mind that it has no relation to reality whatsoever. They supported it. They called for it a long time ago, but so do lots of, the majority of Russians. But, they have been characterized and blown up into these bogeyman figures where striking against them would be a propaganda, a symbolic victory. And Daria herself went to Mariupol, and she reported, she did as a war correspondent, she went there and she talked to the people of Mariupol about what Azov did to them there, how they shot them trying to flee the city as traitors. They took people down into Azovstal. Not all of them. Some of them were family members there willingly and but others as hostages and the like. And what life was like under the rule of the openly, which all of the Western mainstream media grudgingly admitted up until February of this year, neo-Nazi Azov, in Mariupol. And they say that the way it's presented in social media is that Daria Dugin called for the genocide, the extermination of the Ukrainian people. What she actually said, and it's out there, is she talked about the people who committed the crimes in Mariupol against the people of Mariupol, and she was talking specifically about Azov there. She said that those acts were inhuman, not that Ukrainians are subhuman. She said that, again, the wonderful thing about translations, she said that they, how much it can be distorted, and Western mainstream media will never call you on it or, acknowledge it, that these acts were inhuman. And she said the people responsible for them should face war crimes tribunals, like in World War II. That is what she actually said. It became on social media, Daria Dugin calls for genocide of the Ukrainian people. You see what a really evil distortion of what she actually said. That is, and that was used. She was then viewed as a personal enemy by Azov, and how much Azov and the Ukrainian intelligence arm, the SBU, are intertwined now is practically, they are indistinguishable, right? Their members flow in and out of each other. Lots of people from Azov are brought into the SBU because they are the real ideologicals. They are, the people they know that they can be trusted, that aren't collaborators and so forth. So that's why I believe Daria was put on the Mirotvorets hit list, the official hit list of the Kiev regime, the assassination list, along with thousands of other people on there. Basically, anyone who has ever said anything critical of the regime, thousands of Ukrainians, hundreds of Western journalists and celebrities and political figures, whoever has ever said anything critical. Yeah, I mean, you should probably check your own name on there.
Yeah. Dugin was on there. Daria was on there.
And
Western American critics of the war were on there.
Roger Waters is on there.
Right.
Henry Kissinger is on there. John Mearsheimer. It's ridiculous. Anyone who's ever said anything critical. And Daria Dugin's profile has since been marked liquidated across her face.
Right. I don't know if you noticed this or saw this, but right after she was killed, many blue checks on Twitter, major prominent journalists, even a few political leaders celebrated it. Celebrated it. I mean, and these are the same people.
She deserved it.
Yeah, exactly. And these are the same people who had inflated her role and Dugin's role in Russian politics and in the war. So they made her a valuable target, and then they celebrated it.
Yes, they're the liquidation of her, which they had, I believe, an instrumental role in creating the whole situation.
Yes, I think that's right, and
that's why let's Western journalists do not view Russian journalists or any journalists from anywhere with a anti-Kiev regime perspective. Whether that's pro-Russian or just critical of it on its own regard, they regard them as the enemy.
Right.
They are enemy propagandists. We are the truth, right? And everything they say is lies and so forth. And they celebrate the death. I mean, there were 20 journalists killed in Ukraine by Kiev regime forces between 2014 and 2015, 20 journalists and media workers. And was there any talk about 20 journalists being killed, right? Any sense of, oh, these are, professional colleagues? No, because they were all reporting from whether they were Italian or East Ukrainian or whatever, they were all reporting from a pro-Russian perspective. Therefore, they were the enemy and they deserved to die, right? So, I mean, it really is an information war, and the information war has real world effects now. It's has real world consequences, and Daria Dugin, I believe, is only one of the most glaring individual examples of that.
Yes, thank you.